Hey, I'm Jamie Dixon with Guitarist magazine. Now, everybody likes a bit of nylon string acoustic from time to time. There's something very evocative about the sound of it. It's sort of soft and lyrical sort of sounding instrument. Only trouble is that normally when we talk about nylon strings, we're talking about classical guitars. And as compared to most guitars that people play, classical guitars feel quite different. They've got completely flat fingerboard, which means that the fingerboard from edge to edge doesn't curved, which feels a bit different to most electrics, certainly, and certainly steel string acoustics. And the other thing that is a bit different about them is they have very wide nut, typically 2 inches or 50 millimeters. So that feels like a bit of a stretch for a lot of players coming certainly from electric or from conventional steel string acoustics. So this has given rise to what you might call crossover guitars, which several companies are catering to these days. And we've got two here today. The first one I have in my hands here, which is the Auden York, which is crossover acoustic made by a company that's based in Higham Ferrers in Northamptonshire. They make the guitars initially in China, and then they do the final fit and finish over in the UK to a very high standard. And the other guitar we've got is a Cordoba Fusion 5. So Cordoba, a company with huge experience making nylon string and classical guitars. This is their different take on this concept of the crossover. So today, the point of this video is to try out two relatively affordable but high quality crossover nylon string acoustics and see how they measure up to players mostly used to coming from steel string acoustics or electrics. Okay, so let's get under the hood a bit with these two guitars here. First, I'm going to talk you through the specification and features of this Auden York nylon string crossover guitar. So, the basics. Top is cedar. Quite a traditional choice for nylon string guitars, traditionally associated with soft tone. Solid African mahogany sides, mahogany neck, rosewood fingerboard with maple binding. That looks really beautiful. It's all very understated styling, but executed really neatly here. Moving over to the electronics, this guitar has a Brad Clark Supernatural preamp in here, which is fed by a top sensor and a bridge sensor. So together they form a kind of nice natural acoustic sound. You've got a 3-brand EQ on here. You've got 4 kind of preset scenes you can cycle through, so they give you a slightly different preset EQ sound, basically, so that gives you an easy way to access some of the nicest tones that can come out of here when it's amplified. And of course you've got a volume as well, and that's accessed just inside the sound hole. Price-wise, this guitar is at £1,099 at full retail, so it's not quite super boutique, but it's definitely not an entry-level guitar. It's a real serious quality instrument. Okay, so onto the details that make this a crossover guitar rather than a classical nylon string. So firstly, at the nut, you've got a 45mm wide nut instead of the 50mm that you'd find on a traditional classical. So that's half a centimetre less wide. Doesn't sound like a lot, but under your hands it feels, a lot more like a traditional acoustic than it does a big wide classical. So people will find it easier to get their hands around if they're coming from a regular guitar, basically, rather than a classical. Likewise, the radius of the fingerboard is 16 inches, okay, so it has got a slight curve from edge to edge. Now, if you think of a Gibson Les Paul, for example, that's got a 12-inch radius. So it's a bit flatter than that, but it still feels just that bit more familiar than an absolute board flat classical fingerboard does. And again, the scale length is 24.75 inches here, so it's a slightly shorter scale length than you'll find on some guitars, and certainly than the Cordoba. So all of that adds up to a bit more of an easygoing playing experience, and certainly you can do things like hook your thumb over the top, and stuff that you do on a conventional acoustic a bit more naturally than on a classical happen more easily on this guitar. So let's move on to the Cordoba Fusion 5 now. At £450, this is under half the price of the Auden York. So if you're just getting into nylon strings for the first time, this might be a more attractive option for you. It certainly feels like a really nice quality guitar, despite that. There are some significant differences in the way it's been built, though. So let's talk about some of those. So instead of the cedar top that the York has, this one has a spruce top, and it's got laminate, not solid, back and sides. Although they put a really attractive flamed maple veneer on that. And the overall kind of vibe is very classy and upmarket. Unlike the York, this has a nice cutaway for that upper fret access. So again, if you're coming from an electric background and you're getting into that really almost flamenco style, Paco de Lucia style of playing, that might be a really cool thing for you. Fingerboard is again has a 16-inch radius, so not completely flat like a classical. This one's fingerboard is a little bit wider. The nut width over the nut is 48.5, so it's a little bit closer to the sort of classical standard of 50mm. So again, you'll feel that a little bit in your hand there. It might, be a nice halfway house for players who are coming from the other direction, from a classical guitar towards a more agile crossover instrument. So that's worth thinking about with this guitar as well. Pickup and preamp is a Fishman Sonotone Classical, very simple. Just inside the sound hole there, you've got a volume and tone controls, and as usual, the strap button is the means of plugging in. And really, that's this guitar. So that's the comparison between these two guitars. Slightly different price points. What does it stack up to? Well, bearing in mind they are at one is half the price of the other. Cordoba Fusion 5 is under half the price of the Auden York. I think this is fantastic value for money. It's certainly, despite the slightly wider nut than the York, it certainly feels extremely playable. It's got a really lively, sprightly sound, and plugged in it sounds, pretty nice as well. You won't go far wrong for £450 with this one, and again, if it's something you want to dip your toe into, this would probably be the right choice, just to see if you're really into the whole nylon string crossover. The Auden York is inevitably has a slightly more polished performance, if you want to put it that way, sonically. It feels like a more mature guitar. It's got a certain sweetness to it that might be a little to do with the cedar top, and certainly that Brad Clark Supernatural pickup system is just that bit more sophisticated, gives a bit more of the character of the wood, and the sound of the guitar comes through that very nicely. I think it's a really beautifully made guitar, and if you're just that little bit more serious about your nylon string playing, but you don't get on with classicals, I would say that's a really nice investment for £1,099. It's not super boutique money, but it will get you a really solid quality instrument. Both of these instruments definitely worth your attention if you're in the market for that. Try them both, try others, but do get into the crossover guitar. If you've been defeated by classicals in the past, fear not. This kind of guitar could be your ideal partner for those Latin flavoured or bossa style tracks and more, really. So give them a try. If you want to read the full reviews of these guitars that appeared in Guitarist magazine on the Guitar World website, then follow the link up here and you'll find even more info on these two wonderful guitars there. Thanks very much. Have a good one. Cheers.